Hello everyone and welcome in today's session. I hope you're all having a good day. I am Alba Kecha, the organizer of this webinar and the account manager for risk and management at PCB. Me and Gary Sikic, the presenter of this webinar, will be with you for a 30-minute presentation of unintended consequences, the high cost of focusing on risk management instead of managing risk. This webinar will discuss the dangers of focusing on risk management instead of actually managing risk. It addresses the natural tendency to focus risk management plans on obvious and known risks such as the regulatory compliance, the credit risk, reputation risk, and other known natural disasters. This session will cover the following issues: the risk and limitations of knowledge, what's missing from risk management, and outsmarting the future. Mr. Gary is the principal of Logical Management Systems Corporation. He has written over 275 academic and applied papers which have appeared in international journals. I would kindly ask the audience to write your questions that you may have during the webinar in the chat box in the right hand of your control panel, and Gary will try to answer them in the question and answer session. Thank you very much for your attention and enjoy this webinar. Gary, the time is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, as we have an international audience and we span a lot of time zones, so cover all the bases. As I said, my speech is going to be on unintended consequences, what we look at when we start to look at risk and whatnot. This slide is a little bit of a background information on me as far as contact information on LinkedIn and other places, so you can contact me as you need to in terms of questions. With regards to the presentation, let me get into the perspectives that we bring when we start to look at risk and our limitations of knowledge. As it says on the slide here, awareness of risk can lead to unforeseen risk behaviors based on knowledge that is sufficiently convincing to lead to what I call false positives. Well, essentially what I'm saying there is that as you begin to look at risk and as we begin to identify risk, we begin to start to react to it, and we bring with us an analysis bias based on our own personal biases that affects how we see risk. So in many ways we create what I call false positives, which essentially are seeing things that are not necessarily reflected in the reality. My example I would give you here is that after September 11th in the United States, a lot of reactive risk management was going on. And in one of the security magazines, they had written an article about the post-September 11th, are we better prepared than we were before? And the interviews went to roughly the Fortune 1000 companies and government, and people responded, and the net of it was that 67% said that they were better prepared than they were on September 11th, which is a really nice opening sentence until you read the rest of it, which said they were better prepared to access data and information should a crisis occur, where it didn't address the risks of personnel, of buildings, property, etc. It only addressed one aspect of the broader risk that they face. So when we begin to look about risk and we begin to start to think about risk, we need to change the way our mind perceives risk. And in this respect, a lot of the standards that are out there that govern risk management and enterprise risk management need to be looked at with a very broad brushstroke to understand that risk is not necessarily a static perspective. So when we look at this, I use the example here of the fact that over 14 billion pencils are made each year. And you can go to the two links I've got here on YouTube to look at this in a video. The complexity of making a pencil is a lot more than people assume it to be. So if we look at a pencil, we start to see complexity there. You start to begin to understand some aspects of risk, and we look at how we perceive. and what we like to think about when we look at risk. Well, in most people, in most areas, we really like to simplify as much as possible. We like to have concrete reasons for doing things. We like to have causes why we have to do it. And we like things that make sense. And as I put here, even if that sense happens to be wrong. So when we look at the complexity of making a pencil, and by the way, the YouTube videos are quite interesting in that regard, with regards to how much goes into it and how many people are involved in the process, and that no one single person knows the entire process as far as from the point of starting to the point of ending. So we start to realize some things in perspective when we look at risk in that regard. The other things that I find is that in risk management, there's the assumption that the current risk management strategy will work. And we don't really understand the unintended consequences of how we go about addressing risk in this regard. So when we look at that, we assume that risk and our strategy to deal with it is going to be effective and it's going to produce the results that we want. The reality is essentially we don't really have a level playing field, if you will. So as the slide here kind of depicts, the ability to score heading upwards may be a little bit challenging for the team that has the goal at the lower right hand corner, whereas the other side has maybe an advantage in this regard. So when we look at risk, and we have to look at this in this context, understand that risk management, risk is not a compliance. However, compliance serves as a basis for how we manage risk. So when we look at risk, we have to realize that, one, risk is not static. Risk is not focused only on what you need to comply with. It's focused on a broader array. So there may be a lot of non-compliance areas where you find risk that has a direct impact on your organization or an indirect impact on your organization that can create problems if risk is what I call realized, which means that you actually have a risk materialize. So when we look at risk management, you have to look that beyond compliance. We have to look at how we need to channel compliance efforts into a broader thought process of thinking about and managing risk. So as the slide says here in the third bullet, risks and the managing of risk is not directly related to compliance. Rather, risk management is related to ensuring the organization's strategy, goals, and objectives are achieved by buffering risk from being realized. I think that last section there is kind of critical. If my risk management program doesn't reflect the strategies, goals, and objectives of the organization, how can I be effective in buffering risk to protect the organization? So those are kind of a key point that we need to look at. When we begin to understand risk as far as things, what I've seen is that many risk management practitioners are not able to recognize risk until it has been realized, which in a sense, if we look at risk realization, you will see that you don't see a lot of what I'll call transparent vulnerabilities, transparent risk, until they actually materialize. So risk being realized is a materialization of risk, and you're having to deal with the impact of that risk and its effect on the organization. So when we look at that, we need to think about changing, because we need to change our ability to begin to look at the broader pictures and indicators. The Black Swan, which a book was written by Nassim Taleb, talks about black swan events, and as he looks at these issues, we find that when you go searching for black swans, you really cannot anticipate the risk issues because you're too focused on things that are of rare circumstances with large consequences. So you can see my article, Black Swans Are Just Wishful Thinking and Misinterpretation, which is on Continuity Central. that discusses how we need to look at, instead of searching for a black swan, a rare event, a rare risk, we need to be able to prepare for the unintended consequences of that risk being realized in some way, shape, or form. The problem that we unfortunately have is that risk managers, as Nassim Taleb says, are somewhat mediocre at what they do. And the problem there is not that they're not good people or that they're very proficient in a lot of respects. The problem is they don't really understand or recognize, nor do business leaders, nor do government leaders, nor do a lot of people, the aspects of risks, because they haven't recognized the risks. So when we look at risk management and risk models, the theoretical aspects of risks are supposed to manifest themselves. When, in a lot of respects, if you look back, and you can see this in many of the newsletters that are put out that deal with risk or financial advice, that the people who write them generally are not very good at predicting. So I'll draw an example of this, and kind of an interesting one. Back in 1999, we all were preparing for Y2K and the catastrophe. I remember a Fortune magazine that was an article written saying that the Dow Jones Industrial Average would hit 12,000 shortly after year 2000. It took a little bit longer than that for the prediction to be realized, somewhere along the lines of about 10 years after. But the predictor was never challenged after the fact, because the prediction was forgotten. So when we look at risk models and risk theories, we really need to rethink how we look at these things, because we really have some factors that play into our ability to get and use risk data. So these are factors I look at. Lagging data. How far behind are we with data collection with regards to the current situation? Concurrent or coincident data, which is essentially in real time the present situation. Where are we now? It's a constantly changing mosaic, because things don't stay static. Risk doesn't stay static, which is critical to understand. As you go to buffer risk, whatever action you take changes the risk. And realize this: if you recognize a risk, those who operate in your sector or your industry, or however you want to look at it, also will recognize the same risk. So you have to begin to look at, what are they doing to offset it? How does that change your buffering strategies? And how do those things continually have to be reactive in terms of monitoring the changes to the risk paradigm, if you will. Leading data or indicators, it's hard to think about these because we have a difficult time looking at the future in a lot of respects, because there's so much information available and there's so many things going on that we really have to begin to understand the limitations on our ability to look at risk. So as I say here, think about competitive intelligence, which is an element that we need to begin to look at. With regards to risk, again, fundamental uncertainties that derive from our fragmentary understanding of risk and complex system dynamics and interdependencies come into play. How well do we know all the touch points within our organization that are internal, external, and then what I'll call tertiary, which are touch points that just are not revealed. So when we start to look at risk in this regards, you need to understand uncertainty. Uncertainty is not a single dimension. Actually, if we look at uncertainty, we have to look at it almost like a cube, where uncertainty is multidimensional. Events, they're not linear per se, and they carry uncertain outcomes. So when we look at events as they unfold, there's a non-linearity. When you look at buffering risk, you begin to start to see a non-linearity. Opacity, which is something that Nassim Taleb talks about in his book Anti-Fragile, is essentially saying that as things are being looked at, they're not necessarily clear. So it's like looking through a frosted window and trying to make out what exactly is the risk. So this is an area where, because of this opacity, risk management is challenged more and more in order to provide critical information regarding risk and the buffering of risk versus being in compliance with regulations that are fairly straightforward and somewhat prescriptive. Now that's a challenge in a lot of respects for risk management, because one of the things you have to look at is the demand for compliance. The other aspect is then you have to look at senior management's perspective, which is, how do I keep my business, how do I keep my organization doing well and moving forward with regards to achieving our strategies, goals, and objectives. And each day I do that, I have continuity in terms of my operation. So when we look at risk management or business continuity, however we want to look at these programs, enterprise risk management, which, if you will, focusing on survivability. How is my organization going to survive? What does survivability mean to the organization? And how does the organization have to begin to embrace risk management as a way of doing business, not as an adjunct to the business that's being done? So when we look at these overwhelming risks that are facing us today, we really have to understand that when we concentrate in one area, we can result in finding ourselves being completely devastated by risks that are not readily apparent. So we really need to think about risk in this context and begin to start to look at what are the things that we should be looking for that we just don't realize until we're faced with them. And a great example of this is during the pandemic planning area when bird flu, the H5N1, looked to be like it was going to be a global pandemic. I wrote a book called Protecting Your Business in a Pandemic, which literally focused on business, not masks and gloves and other types of things, because as I point out in the book, the history has shown us that pandemics run somewhere around 500, 800 days. So being able to have the medical supplies, masks, etc., for that period of time is a challenge, and it's hugely costly for an organization. And there's other things from a risk perspective that come to mind. But I had the introduction written by the chairman of the Chicago Board of Trade, and he pointed out to me one day a very interesting perspective with regards to risk. We were in his office and we were looking over all the trading floors at the Board of Trade, and he was pointing out the various pits where the trading was going on. So you had soybeans, you had corn, you had bonds, etc., etc. And he said, we're going to have a real problem. And I said, yes, you won't be able to do as much trading with OpenCry. You'll have to go to more electronic, and that's going to be a challenge. He said, no, there's going to be a food crisis. And I thought, well, what do you mean? His basic perspective was simple. He said, if you're telling me that roughly 40% of the people are going to get sick as a result of this flu pandemic if it occurs, then we have a very small population of USDA, U.S. Department of Agricultural food inspectors. And if the products that are being traded commodities-wise are not certified with a USDA stamp of approval, the risks portend for the trader far greater than not trading. So as he said, the food chain will literally stop because the traders who are out there won't take the risk of getting tainted product. So it's a challenge in a lot of respects in this regard. So I'll focus this on the kind of perspective I bring with this, that if you look at an organization's strategies, you have to look at what their strategic initiatives are, and this is kind of an example as far as a flow. Look at the potential risk, look at the interoperability, play between those risks, and then begin to find key risk indicators that you can establish to evaluate the changes in potential risks and their potential effect on strategic initiatives. Now, understand that this can be either positive or negative. So when we look at these aspects, understand key risk indicators can actually produce positive risk for an organization versus just negative risk as we have a tendency to look at. So when we look at risk and look at achieving corporate goals and objectives, and I talk in this in the business sense, but it applies in a governmental sense, we really look at a broadening of our understanding of risk and looking at a broadening of key risk indicators to begin to combine more analysis of more types of risk than we might be focused on with regards to regulatory compliance in some respects. So my focus in a lot of respects and the work we do with companies and organizations that we consult with is focused on these four areas. Your company has strategy, goals, and objectives, your mission. This is what you develop strategic plans for, and you go out and set goals and objectives, and people go out to achieve these, whether they be sales figures or they be other relation figures to the goals of the organization, whether we want to grow, how many people we want, what do we want to do to become more efficient. All these things form your strategic goals and objectives. And you have to really look at how I'm going to achieve those things. Well, one way of looking at achieving strategic goals and objectives is to find out what's going on in the marketplace. So what I do is set up a competitive intelligence perspective. So we collect, analyze, and then we recommend and move forward on these things. With regards to business continuity, I want to make sure my business runs efficiently and stays without crisis, so to speak. And now that's a big aspect because we have to look at just a number of areas within the business that potentially are subject to crisis. And then we have to look at external to the business, what are the things that are provided for my business that keeps us running that is not part of what we consider the, quote, core elements of the business. And that's critical that we understand that, because one of the biggest issues that we face is the vulnerability or risk of a supplier, a vendor, etc., becoming our crisis, if you will. And then you have to look at, from the other aspect here, customers. You're in business to sell a product or service. There's a risk that a customer you have is going to choose another organization and that you lose that revenue stream. That impacts you from a number of perspectives in terms of your ability to achieve corporate goals and objectives. So when we look at risk management, look at these aspects: identifying the risks, ranking the risks, buffering the risks, which is a constant process, it's not a single process, and then monitoring the effectiveness of the buffering. So risk over time changing because you're reacting to it, you're doing something to modify it, you're doing something to protect your organization, and as a result, you're also finding yourself in a situation where others are doing the same thing, so the risk is constantly changing. The best way I can describe to you this perspective is an article I did, which again appears on Continuity Central, that talked about thinking like a commodities trader when it comes to risk. And people kind of look and think, well, what do you mean by thinking like a commodities trader? Well, commodities traders have a tendency to look at risk very, very incrementally. And incrementally can be in milliseconds, it can be in seconds, and it can be in minutes for them. They're constantly looking at what they need to do to offset the risks that are being created as they buy products: corn, soybeans, oil, gold, silver, platinum, you name the commodity. They're constantly working at hedging against risk that that commodity is going to change and that their portfolio is going to change negatively as a result of a risk being realized. So this is critical that we understand that, and it's critical we kind of move forward in this area to begin to look at how we need to change our thought process in order to focus on risk as a not necessarily mitigatable from a standpoint of termination as far as risk goes. So when we look at mitigation of risk, we're looking at incremental buffering of risk, achieving what organizations need to look at to achieve a parity between risk and the efforts being made to manage and monitor the risk and to keep that risk at bay, so to speak. So there are a number of things that can be done. If we look at this kind of process, you start to see that there's the normal activities, what I call the things we should be doing, analysis, trending, forecast, etc. You can kind of go down the list. Building a mosaic is essentially my perspective. You build a mosaic, and the mosaic's constantly changing, so you're constantly adding pieces and changing the look of pieces. In crisis, which is where most organizations operate in a lot of respects, crisis is not necessarily as profound, if you will, as the large-scale disasters that we may encounter with organizations. So we operate in sort of what I call a crisis mode on a daily basis. We still do analysis, we do insights, we begin to start to look at what are the connectors, what are my touch points, what do I have to do from a planning standpoint to deal with the risks that are being presented to me and that could potentially affect our ability to achieve our goals and objectives. So we start to look at building scenarios. We start to look at what are the options available. We start to look at increased collection, increased research, building and developing more insights into things that are transparent that we just don't see until they're put in front of us, and then changing this mosaic. So you see that changing the mosaic, control distribution, all these things are activities that are part of the process. When we start to look at this whole process of risk and business continuity, it becomes critical for organizations to understand the need that they have to deal with risk in a broad sense and to constantly be monitoring and buffering that risk as far as how it presents itself. So think about feeling good about risk in this context. If I've got a variety of buffering programs, insurance, offsetting the risk to other parties, other types of things that I do to make the risk, how would you put it, to distance the risk from my organization, I really need to look at the realization is that as I do all these things, I've really changed the risk, and now it's not necessarily what I'll call a new risk, but it's a risk that has changed in terms of how it might attack my organization if it's realized. So think about things like supply chain. And when you think about supply chains and you look at criticality worldwide and the interconnectivity we have worldwide today, you start to see risk materializing in a really broad fashion. So to give you an example, a computer chip that goes into a Dell computer or a laptop that someone's making, generally that chip will cross the Pacific Ocean 3 or 4 times before it goes into the computer. And that may not be a computer that's being assembled in the United States. It may be assembled in Brazil, Ireland, Malaysia, somewhere other than where the end user is. So now I have risk. I have risk that I have to look at in terms of meeting the demand, customer demand. I have risk that I have to look at in terms of my supply chain. I have risk that I have to look at that is geopolitical. I have risk that I have to look at that is infrastructure based. I have risk that I have to look at that is beyond the norm, if you will, of risk that would be required to be evaluated from a compliance standpoint. So all these things interact, and if we have a tendency, as most organizations and human nature, I would say, to silo risk in various aspects of the organization, whether they are legal, financial, operational, strategic, etc., you really start to see these silos being formed, and we don't see a lot of perforation. So there's not a lot of risk-sharing information, which is really critical in a lot of respects, because in having risk information, you might find that you'll change your perspective on how you're going to deal with the risk issue. So my question with this is, if we look at my concluding slide here, it says if you keep doing what you have always done, you're going to keep getting the same results that you've always gotten. So if we think about risk in this context, and we have a picture here of a large boulder perched over a man. Now, if that boulder would fall on the person, it would have a devastating potential effect. However, if we look at the risk and begin to break it down into its basic elements, we can reduce the effect of impact. So take, for instance, this, let's say, 1,000-pound boulder. The effect of it hitting is catastrophic on the individual. However, if I break this 1,000-pound boulder into a bunch of little pebbles that equivalently provide a cumulative 1,000 pounds and drop each pebble one at a time, the results are going to be totally different. So we look at a resilience that can be generated for the organization by breaking down risks and beginning to look at how these things can be managed on a smaller basis, so that as they impact, there's less and less of a consequence, and there's more resilience to move forward on dealing with the broader based issues of risk. So at this time, I'll open it up for questions, and we'll turn it over to our moderator and see what questions we have.
Thank you very much for this very informative webinar, Gary. I would like to ask the audience to ask your questions now. In the meantime, I will start with the first question. The first question is, what is the ideal approach organizations should apply while doing their risk assessment?
It depends on the organization. I'll say that in that way, not to be sounding flip about the question, but you cannot prescribe how an organization should approach risk and risk management and make it, how would I put it, make it applicable to all organizations. So it has to be custom fitted to the organization. And the perspective that I would say in the regards to this aspect of risk management is that the organization has to look at its goals and objectives, which are critical. What is our strategy? How are we going to achieve these? And then begin to take a very long look at all ends of as far as what I'll call touch points. So we have touch points that are customers, we have touch points that are vendors, we have touch points that are suppliers, we have internal touch points. So knowing and assessing these touch points, which is not the easiest thing to do. And I'll give you the example of supply chain. I have a supplier. Well, my supplier has suppliers. Well, how do I know that the suppliers are going to be able to provide what I need coming through that channel? So we have a challenge there, and it matters as to the depth of analysis that you want to go through. And you want to be able to have this system to be as responsive as possible. So one of the key elements I would say for an organization is knowing the corporate goals and objectives, and I'll use the term corporate in a very broad sense, but knowing the objectives that are set forth, what do we want to achieve? Whether it's 10% growth, 5% growth, opening new markets, beginning to expand in different areas where you don't have a market presence, all those things need to be known. And then we need to take into context what are the threats and vulnerabilities and risks that we face as we go into these areas. So a good example, and this may be one of those that you'd have to begin to look at as the broad base of risk. The Japan earthquake tsunami that occurred 5 years ago brought to light a lot of things in terms of risk management. The Japanese responded extremely well. The Japanese have experience with tsunamis. They get roughly three a day, not necessarily the scale that they had with the earthquake that they had, but it's not uncommon. When you look at history, Japan's got a pretty good history of looking at how to deal with these kind of things, earthquake and tsunami. It's the magnitude that was unexpected. And the fact is that they had built tsunami walls that were 30 meters high, but the earthquake actually caused the tsunami walls to sink below the 30 meters, hence the tsunami overwhelmed the tsunami walls, and you have this whole situation. Well, if we look at this aspect, you start to realize there's risk that's presented. So for instance, you take an auto manufacturer, and I'll use the example, I think it was Toyota. Toyota had some really good marketing going on for new product models, and they had some great paint that they were offering as far as colors. They had done a very big worldwide campaign. And as the tsunami earthquake hit, the problem that they encountered was one that they had not thought about from an anticipation of risk. The supplier for paint was a German company. Now, one would say, okay, a German company must be in Germany. Well, it is, but the paint production facility was adjacent to the Toyota manufacturing facility in order to be able to get this kind of quick supply demand being met. So the reality was that the unfortunate aspect of risk being realized was that not only did Toyota have a problem, but the German manufacturer of the paint products had a problem because they were almost co-located. So you had risk on a supplier side that impacted the organization. So they had to go back out worldwide and say, well, that paint color is not available at the present time. Now that may sound like a small issue, but when you look at the magnitude of sales worldwide of automobiles and you look at particular customer demand, that risk suddenly became an issue. It's like having a car that consists of 30,000 parts and having 29,999 parts available. The one part that's missing precludes you from being able to produce the car. So when I look at risk for an organization, I said my best approach and the best look at this is, one, you need to begin to understand your organization, and you need to begin to understand the interconnectivity, the touch points of your organization, and then realize that that risk that you identify impacts that entire chain. And you begin to start to look at some of the complexity of managing risk in that regard. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much, Gary, for this answer. We have another question here. Can you have excellent compliance and poor management of risk and vice versa?
Yes. I would say that the problem with focusing too much on compliance is that you overlook the risks in a lot of respects. And then the other aspect is you can be excellent with regards to risk management and totally be out of compliance with the regulatory initiatives. And this is a challenge, I think, in a lot of respects today, because not only do you have regulatory initiatives that are individually based in nations, at a governmental area there, but then you have it broken down into sub-elements United States, so we have the federal government, the state government, then local government. How do I comply with all these risk standards? And then what do I do when some of the risk standards in terms of compliance conflict with each other? So you have ISO, you have other standards, and then you have the international standards. And it's interesting. I'll give you a kind of a vignette. I did a lot of work back in the 90s in Nigeria, and the Nigerians essentially said whatever the compliance requirements for health and safety in the U.S. are, we adapt those to here. You know, we take them and say this is the compliance standard. You had two different perspectives. That Nigerian compliance standard that was written based on U.S. standards saying we're going to do this, and then the actual ability to actually implement it effectively, which was almost non-existent because the fact was people didn't adhere because it didn't make practical sense to them. So from a cultural standpoint, you have challenges with regards to getting a broad-based risk management program and getting it to standards and being effective. And I found that the most effective programs are programs that look at the analysis of what's required and then say, this is how we will deal with this particular requirement based on our organization, based on our structure, and based on our ability to deal with it. A lot of organizations I've known in the, that I've worked with have actually offset risk in order to not have to comply with certain standards. So they've made conscious decisions on how to deal with that risk. Now the offsetting might be with a supplier, might be with an outsourced partner, but the reality is that in order to not have to deal with compliance, you create a risk that is non-compliance based. Now that I have to manage that risk. So the whole aspect of managing risk is challenging at best, and having a good compliance program is essential in a lot of respects, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you've actually complied or that you've actually managed the risk. So it's a challenge, and it's kind of a how would I put it? It's kind of walking on a tightrope, if you will.
Thank you, Gary, again for answering these questions. We have here 6 or 7 more questions, but because of the time limitations, we will be answering them throughout email individually. I want to thank all the attendees as well who have joined us today. I hope your questions have been answered. I also want to inform you that this webinar is recorded and can be found on PCB YouTube channel and in our website, pcb.com. Additionally, PCB appreciates your comments and suggestions. Thus, I would kindly ask you to write down your suggestions on the upcoming webinar topics in the question that will be shown at the very end of this session. Looking forward to seeing you all next week in a very interesting topic of risk treatment, cost versus benefit. Until then, have a great week. Gary, thank you very much for this excellent presentation.
Thank you. I appreciate it.